right. Today, last but not least in our series of Western ethical theories, is existentialism. Which I'm also going to discuss in the context of postmodern ethics. And I will explain the connection as we go. This one might take a couple videos to cover, though, because I really enjoy this one. So existentialism. Anyone want to take a shot at defining it before we get into it?
Pontificating on the human condition.
Ooh, that's nice. Pontificating or pondering?
Both.
Okay. Anyone else? We watched the Teach Me Existentialism Like I'm 5 video, and that basically boiled it down to there are no rules, just do whatever you want. And I could certainly see that enfolded in here.
It considers that the only truth is your own truth, basically, what you decide.
And it doesn't mean there's not other truth out there. It's simply the only one you can know is yours.
Specifically experiential truth.
Oh, wow. So good. I should be writing these down. And we will in just a minute. Before I get to that, though, oh, here comes the rain. What a blessing. We live in Southern California, so this is a treat. We get all excited when we see rain. Okay, so first I want to start with who I want to give credit for being the founder of existentialism. There's lots of people who will say it's different people, but I'm going with Soren. And so just a roadmap, if you're watching this online or something, I'm going to start with theistic, specifically Christian existentialism developed by Soren Kierkegaard, but then we're going to talk about, I know, it is shocking. Then we are going to talk about more agnostic existentialism, kind of like Sartre or Camus, French existential philosophers. And I also want to give a shout out to Friedrich Nietzsche. And I don't even want to really call him an atheist. He's more of an anti-Christ existentialist. He's very hostile to Christianity, and for good reason, and I'll explain it as we go. But how do we get such diversity within this theory, where we can have everyone from Kierkegaard, who wants this intimate personal relationship with Jesus, and Nietzsche, who believes that basically God is dead and we killed him, and now we have to live with the consequences, and we have to make our own truth and our own lives. And so we're going to have a full spectrum, so I hope you can watch through all of it, because I think some of it will resonate with almost anyone. So the first guy I want to tell you about is Soren. And Soren Kierkegaard that's a name. He was a Danish philosopher, lived in Denmark. He's living in the early part of the 19th century, so early 1800s. I think he's dead by mid-1800s. He only lived, I believe, around 45 years of age. I'd have to look to make exact sure, but very short life, but it was a life full of wonder, and he produced an amazing amount of work. I want to give you a little bit about his background so you can understand what an exceptional person Soren was. His father, when his father was a boy, I believe he was a shepherd, and one day out in the fields he was having a bad day and he actually cursed God. But it had a profound effect on his father, and his father suffered mightily. All of Soren's older siblings, and I believe his mother, died, and it was just Soren and his father together. And his father was afraid that all of that was due to him cursing God in his youth, and he always lived under that constant fear that he was going to take Soren from him as well. But Soren was truly a phenomenal child, and he so invested in him and his education. When Soren's father sent him to school, he told him, I want you to score third highest in your class. Because anyone can score highest, but it takes a true wonder to not only know how you're doing, but how your peers are doing in order to come in third in your course. I mean, just let that resonate with you a bit. that kind of parenting and that kind of expectation. His father in later years became a well-off citizen in their town, and he would invite kind of the movers and shakers, artists, philosophers, theologians, entertainers, just whoever was who. And they would have these dinner parties, and Soren was told to watch and listen from an adjoining room. And after the guest had left, his father would have him sit in each seat the guest had occupied, and he would have to recount what that guest had said during the party and give like an account for the conversation. And so if you can imagine that kind of training of listening, memory, and then critical analysis of what was said and why. And just brilliant. And so he uses this mind, and this is part of the paradox of Kierkegaard. He takes a very anti-rational approach to ethics and philosophy, but he uses meticulous logic to deconstruct reason and logic. So he's not being irrational, he's being incredibly systematically logical in deconstructing logic and reason, which is just such a beautiful paradox to me. He said, God gave me a great intellect to tear down the strongholds of the intellectuals. And so he becomes like this white knight of faith, sort of. This very romantic sort of imagery comes to my mind when I think of Soren. Kierkegaard basically is living in 19th century Denmark as part of the Dutch Reformed Church, which I'm sure is very reformed, a lot of Calvinistic predestination sorts of elements. And in his book, he was excommunicated, I believe, at least 3 times, if not more. I'm not sure how you do that. But when he wrote Attack Upon Christendom, he liked sarcasm and irony as well. And he basically said, I live in the most amazing country of Denmark. He says, where virtually everyone is a Christian. Even the Jews and Muslims are practically Christians. Even the dogs and cats are Christians. But the problem is, when everyone's a Christian, no one's a Christian, because it doesn't mean a stinking thing. It just means you're from Denmark. It would be like America 50 years ago. If you were from America, you would probably identify as Christian, simply because you were born in America. But it didn't mean a certain set of beliefs or faith or creeds. It was just like this inherited, born into belief. And so Kierkegaard, that is not sitting well with him. And he wants to change the question. So if you remember at the beginning of this class, I think the very first week, I had you play the game with me, what is a Christian? And I was kind of fishing for the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, those sorts of universals that almost everyone in Christendom for the last 1,500 years has at least given some sort of agreement to. But Kierkegaard changes the question to, what must I do to be a Christian? And see, now he's made it an existential question. It's not an abstract, give me the theology or the philosophy behind Christendom or what it means to be a Christian. Now he's talking about personally, what would it look like for me, Soren, to be a Christian? And that question changes everything. He's trying to get people out of their heads into their hearts, out of an intellectual understanding to an actual relationship. It would be like if I ask you, how many of you know Donald Trump? Now, everyone in this room knows plenty about Donald Trump, but do any of you actually know Donald Trump? And I don't think so. I don't. And that's the difference. He's saying, lots of people know all sorts of things about Christendom and God and Jesus, but do they know God or Jesus personally? And even in Greek, there's different Greek words for different types of knowledge. Gnosko basically means to know. And generally, and I would encourage you, like if you're using your Blue Letter Bible app, I think in 2 Peter 1, all 3 usages are there of the word for knowledge. So gnosis, remember, is the root for knowledge or to know. where we get like Gnostic from, those who know. Gnosko, this would be like knowledge through authority or learning from books or instruction, that sort of knowledge, kind of that intellectual knowledge. But there's another word called epignosko, and I've heard it defined different ways, but I like to think of this more in terms of experiential knowledge. I've heard people say this is true knowledge, and I would agree with it, as opposed to this kind. This is like a deeper level. This is something you actually have personally experienced or encountered. Not just what someone else said, not just what you read in a book, etc. So for example, I know a little bit about, let's use something, heroin addiction. You know, I've read about junkies, I've been to Al-Anon meetings, I've seen books on, you know, how to treat people suffering with addiction. But until I personally shoot up heroin and become addicted to it, I do not epignosko what heroin addiction is. I can gnosko it, I can actually be an expert on it, I could even do treatments or give therapy or things like that out of this intellectual knowledge. But I don't really experientially know it until I become a junkie myself. Does that make sense, the difference of knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then there's a third type, which I can't recall at the moment, and it's where you take knowledge that you've learned either intellectually or experientially, and you can draw it forth and apply it into life. Which to me, that would be the best kind of knowledge. That's where it kind of goes from knowledge into sort of like wisdom for me, where it's not just something you have or you've experienced, but you know how to bring it up and apply it to different situations and variables. And I believe, we'll double check later, but I think in 2 Peter 1, if you look at the Greek words when it's using know or knowledge, it has all three of those forms. And you see it build in the passage how Peter's talking about different ways of knowing. So you gotta love the Greeks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So precise when it comes to abstract thinking and principles. Okay, so that being said, I like to consider him the father of existentialism simply for asking this question. But the very first premise of existentialism is individualism. And because it is so individualistic, it is literally impossible to get a universal definition of what existentialism means, because every individual can have their own definition. And it took me forever to figure this out. When I first heard this term in the 70s, lots of my friends, Peter's family, would be saying stuff like, oh, have you seen that existential movie? Or that's such an existential novel, or like Dostoevsky, existentialism, or, you know, and I'm just like, well, what does that mean? And people would be like, well, you know, it's kind of like, I can't really describe it. And that was not good enough for me, even as a young man. And so I went out and bought my first book on existentialism. It was just called Existentialism by, I think, John McNamara. And I think you can still get it on Amazon. There's a little pitch for him. And I've never read a book like that. It was only like 150 pages, but I think, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, I think the first 60 pages was a preface, hence my own book. We'll work on that later. But because he was trying to explain why he couldn't define existentialism. And I just fell in love with it at that point. I just thought, yes, this is what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to try to define it for you. Rather, I'm going to, I'll just ignore this drawing. I don't know what that was from. Oh, that's from modern philosophy. In a lot of ways, and you'll see how this unfolds, this is really a reaction against modernism. And remember, modern philosophy, it goes from like the 16th, 17th century. And after Kant, we enter into what I would consider the postmodern era of philosophy, which is weird when we think about it culturally, because we don't really think about postmodern hitting us socially until maybe the beat movement in the 50s, and then the counterculture movement in the 60s and 70s. and we kind of into what we would consider a postmodern America in our mentality and ways of thinking. But it started philosophically. I would trace it all the way back to Kant, when he, instead of doing the either or, started talking about the both and people began to change, and then Hegel ran with it, etc. But onward. So in existentialism, instead of defining it, I'm going to give you themes that many, but not all, existentialists might adhere to. First is, I'm going to start with, so I'm going to put here themes, so you don't confuse it with a definition. So these may or may not apply to various people who identify with this theory. The first one I want to put is the individual. And that is what Kierkegaard wanted on his tombstone. The individual. That's it. And I love it so. But because he believes in this radical individuality, it brings about alienation. Because right now, this is a small classroom. I mean, we only got like a half dozen people in here. But there's probably at least 10 or more different classes happening right now in this room. Because for one thing, the class I'm teaching is not the class you're taking. None of you are taking the same class, and I've never taught the same class twice, even though I just taught this very lecture 30 minutes ago next door. It was not the lecture you're going to get now. And what you hear is not what I'm saying. Because when it comes into you, you interpret it, you put it through your filters of your life and your experiences. And that's the experiential piece Jacob already mentioned, was this is like an experience-based knowledge, an epigenosko sort of theory. Not just intellectual, but experiential. And that's the existential part. But because of this radical individualism, we get alienation. Alienation, yes. So if each of these represents like a different person in this room, some of you are acquaintances, some of you might be close friends, etc. Some of you might be even at like soul level connection, right? Where you don't even have to talk. There's so much you share in common. Mm-hmm. But Kierkegaard would say, you're all living alone and isolated and alienated because you're such incredible individuals. No one else can possibly understand you. And you might say, that's not true. I'm so close with my financier, I mean my fiance, that he is, we don't even have to talk, right? We're just right there. But even if you have complete transparency, it doesn't mean they understand you, because they're not you. And you can tell someone all your deepest secrets, all your greatest fears, and they may nod, but they do not understand because they are not you. Mm-hmm. It's like my own family. My sister and I, she's 5 years younger than me, had the same biological parents. We grew up under the same roof. We did not grow up in the same family. And how do I know this? Because when I hear her talk, I'm just thinking, where did you grow up? Where did you go to Sunday school? Because how is this possible? But it's because we are so different that even how we were parented was so different. Even though it was the same biological people, we had a different relationship to our parents than each other had. Plus I was older, different gender, all sorts of different variables. And you can see this like when you go home for the holidays, or you're talking with friends about some past event or some trip you took or some Christmas. And when you're listening to other people talk, you're just like, were you even there? That is not what happened, or that is not the order of events. And it's just so stunning to hear other people's narratives about what happened or who they are or who you are. And that's kind of what this is pointing out, is it's all perspectival. Mm-hmm. It's perspectival truth. No human has this market on absolute, objective, universal truth. You have little t truth. You have subjective truth. And before I get too carried away, Kierkegaard's solution for this alienation is it's very Christian. He believes only in Christ, and those who have the Spirit of Christ, they can now have fellowship with, not only with Christ through his Holy Spirit, but the Spirit of God in them can now fellowship with the Spirit of God in another. And we can actually know and be known for the first time in our lives. But outside of Christ, we're just trapped in our own subjectivity. And that's actually how I would define fellowship as opposed to friendship, where you're actually having a spirit, Holy Spirit level communion with another human being, and it's not just based on having the same politics or taste or hobbies or preferences. You're actually communing with God's Spirit, the same Spirit that is within you in another. And that is where Kierkegaard believes you actually find yourself and you're no longer alienated from the world. How is alienation caused? He has another great word that comes from alienation, and that is angst. And I love this word because it's a hybrid word. It means anxiety, fear, and dread, all rolled up into one. And I should have had that Edward Monk image up for you to see. That would be a great background image. Maybe I'll pull it up in a minute. But Edward Monk made this painting called The Scream, and you've probably seen it. It's kind of surrealistic. It's like this almost cartoony looking figure on this bridge, and he's just holding his face and just this primordial, existential, angst-filled scream. And if you saw the first Matrix, Morpheus is talking to Neo, and Neo obviously knows something's wrong, and Morpheus said, yes, it's like a splinter in your mind. You can't remove it, and you don't even know what's wrong, you just know something's wrong. And that would be such a great description of this. Because it's not a fear of something in particular, it's like just this feeling, this unsettled something is wrong. And it brings this great anxiety and dread upon you. Kierkegaard believes it's because of our alienation from God, and it leaves us in this disfellowship place, this place of God's wrath and judgment. And the only solution, of course, is to be reconciled to God through Christ. So he's all in on this theistic Christian paradigm of how to deal with this alienation. All right. Where do I want to go? Authenticity. The point here is to find out who you are and to be true to yourself. All the way back to Socrates, right? Know thyself. And I think Shakespeare, to thine own self be true. Mm-hmm. But you have to know who you are before you can be true to yourself. And that's the problem. So many people want to label you or categorize you or tell you who you are or who you ought to be, that very few people are allowed to have an authentic life. You have to fight for your authenticity because people want to capture your identity and tell you who or what you ought to be, or who you are, what your value is, what your worth is. So I'm going to put rejects, categories, and labels. Kierkegaard, one of my favorite quotes is, he says, if you label me, you negate me. And think about that. For years, I would not even identify as a Christian because what that meant to me and what it meant to most of the people who were asking me if I was one, it wasn't even the same thing. So for me to say, yes, I'm a Christian to those people, they were completely missing who I was or what I believed because they already had this set idea of what a Christian was or what an evangelical was or a fundamentalist. Just like it could happen in politics, right? If you tell someone you're a Democrat or Republican, they already have this huge box as they throw you in, like, oh, you're blue, you're red, and they assume all these things about you, which may or may not be true. And that you could do that with 1,000 things, right? 1,000 labels, but when you label someone, you don't have to deal with their individuality anymore. You can just deal with the category you've put them in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jim.
Okay, so in regards to authenticity, would you say, according to existentialism, that is like static? Well, not static. That's not the wrong word. Give me a second.
Core. It's your essential self.
So But let's just see. How do you know who you really are, I guess, is the question that I'm trying to answer. Like, is there a true you that regardless of what you think you are is actually who you are?
Yes. But see, that's my version of existentialism. And remember, everyone can make their own version. And that's why even while I'm calling these themes and not a definition, because not all existentialists would agree with what I'm about to tell you, or what Kierkegaard said. But see, that's part of this whole problem of categories and labels as well. I know almost no one who calls themselves an existentialist. Because then you've labeled them and negated them.
Mm-hmm.
It's even, let me give you a mild postmodern version. I dare you to go up to almost any hipster, and maybe that's changed by now, but I dare you to try to get a hipster to self-identify as a hipster. It is almost impossible because they don't want to be labeled. Because they're embracing what they perceive as radical individuality. But when all the individuals look the same, you've lost your way, I think, would be my thing. It's turned into this weird self-referential paradox. Did I answer your question?
No, you did when you said that, yes, but some might disagree, I guess.
Oh.
And my initial question was,
Okay.
yeah, is there a true self regardless of what you think
So
about yourself?
some existentialists, and I'm not sure, I've heard lectures on Kierkegaard where I could see him going either way here. But a lot of existentialists, we'll get back to the themes in a minute, but I think that's a great point you're raising, so I'm gonna just put it off to the side here. They would say existence precedes, is it precedes or proceeds? Precedes. Is that right, or two E's together? Existence precedes essence. Double ED or EDE?
It's good.
Okay, thank you. Left out. All those words, extreme, they always mess me up. I don't know where the E's go. Okay, so unpack that for me. Existence precedes essence. That's such a wild thought. But many people in our postmodern society or post-postmodern society have totally embraced this idea. I don't believe that's a Christian thought. And like I said, I think you could argue Kierkegaard in several ways with this one.
Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely a more secular humanist or materialistic thought. I think like Sartre and Camus, maybe even Nietzsche would agree with that. So existence, actually living your life, precedes the core of who you really are. In other words, your experiences define you and make you. There is no you before you've had an experience. And this is where it gets so weird, because now it almost sounds like we're talking about Buddhism, or specifically Zen Buddhism, where you just become one of those string balls or rubber band balls where each string is an experience, and you're a composite of all your life experiences, and that is your essence. But see, if you try to deconstruct the self and you start saying, well, that was my experience learning how to ride a bike, that was my experience of losing my first tooth, that was my first experience of confirmation, that was when I got married, and you unravel all those experiences, there is no self. That's what that's getting at.
So would people who hold to that then not be able to identify as anything?
Yeah, they would just be a composite of their experiences, and then maybe identifying with certain experiences or building their narrative, their personal story off of choosing from the experiences they wanted to embrace, and then maybe turning away or rejecting. But see, negative experiences can also define us if we let them have that power on us, like as a victim, right? Or you know,
But
whatever.
would choosing to emphasize anything like take you away from what you really are?
But it's almost arguing that you cannot separate yourself from those experiences because it is what you are. It defines you. It's part of the existential
You
perspective.
can choose to separate yourself from some of those experiences.
Can you, though? From this argument, those experiences define.
That's what
Yeah.
I'm getting at, though. Like, if you're
See-
an existentialist that identifies as or aligns with anything, then is that kind of besides the point?
But see, it's not just the experience, it's your interpretation of the experience and how you put it into your narrative.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because two people could have the same series of circumstances or experiences, but what they do with those are so radically different. And I think a lot of times it has to do with where we are today, where we look back. Like you could have someone that's strung out, living in the gutter, just they've hit rock bottom as far as our society is concerned, and someone else who could be like a CFO of a Fortune 500 company. And they could look back on their life, both of them may have had absentee fathers or domineering mothers, or they could have lived in a rough neighborhood, or they could have gone to jail when they were a teenager, or been in the military, or had a divorce, or had certain kids, or got kicked out of school. But see, if you're in the gutter, you could see how each one of those was a step down the ladder to where you are now. But for someone who's doing well, it could be the same circumstances, and you could see how each one was a step to get you to the place you are today. So you're interpreting the past through the present. Memories we never have pristine memories. They're always through the filter of now. It's so weird and disturbing. And it's part of why when you ask people about their perspective, especially people you knew and were like this class, if like a year from now you're like, hey, remember in Blackburn's class when he set us free? And you're like, what are you talking about? I've been struggling in existential angst ever since that day, and I don't even know what I'm going to do with myself. Every day I just wonder which is the best way to die. And someone else may have never looked back and are completely free. It's changed their life, and they could attribute it to the same date, the same event, but because of their subjective individual selves and how that affected them, it could be completely different trajectories. That was a big explanation, but it was an important question. Let me finish out the themes. That would be a good use of today, and then we'll get into like the difference between objective and subjective truth next time we meet. Okay, so we got individualism, alienation, angst, authenticity, rejects categories, labels. I love this one. Truth is subjectivity. I think this also got him excommunicated again. Truth is subjectivity. Oh, a point on reading Kierkegaard, you have to remember, he wrote using pseudonyms in almost all his books. He wrote like I teach, kind of first person. So he was also a perspective junkie. He liked to get into a certain frame of mind and he would explore it out. He would take it to its logical conclusion. But then he would move over, pick another pseudonym and write a book from that perspective. And he would just keep moving around perspective. So you can't just read him and say, oh, this is what Soren believes. Because he's demonstrating different points of view, because he's not trying to get you to believe what he believes. He's trying to get you to find out what you believe and why. And he's showing you the process on how to do this. And part of it is it's almost like being a perspective tourist, where and I call it world jumping, where I'm actually trying to jump into other people's perspectives and to sample it and see what it's like, and then to come back into my own. Now, I'm obviously taking my perspective with me, but that's why I love reading different philosophers, different religions, different socioeconomic or political views, different orientations, gender, sexual identity. I just love getting a peek into how other people are seeing reality. But see, it's a subjective, personal reality for them. And my hope is the more perspectives I can get a better view of what capital R reality really is. But the more narrow your perspective is, and if you only hang out with people that think like you, look like you, believe like you, talk like you, you're going to have a very little thing. That's part of the value of a liberal arts education, is you're supposed to be given a lot of different perspectives that you can compare and navigate and kind of pit against each other. At least that's how I see education, as opposed to, say, like an indoctrination approach where you're given one perspective, this is the truth, this is the way it is, and any deviation from that is wrong. You know, that's, now if someone is really giving you the truth, well, great. Why would you want to mess with false narratives? But I do not have a lot of faith that someone has that sort of absolute universal thing they could give me. Okay, truth is subjective. They can embrace the paradox. Part of the paradox is this idea of radical freedom. Now, by freedom, he doesn't mean I can choose to fly or hold my breath underwater for 10 minutes or those sorts of things. In fact, in a lot of things, we don't have freedom. It's like the luck of the draw, or fate, or providence, or predestination if you're a Calvinist. But this is a very anti-Calvinist sort of theology, because Kierkegaard believes you can actually make real choices with real eternal consequences. And in that freedom, though, like I said, some of you might be born with the Denny's 2-pack of crayons, and some might get the Crayola 246-pack of crayons. That may be out of your choice. It's simply the luck of the genetic draw, or where you were born, or your parents, all that. What you do have a choice with is your attitude and what you're going to do with what you've been given. And some people can do more with that Denny's 2-pack than other people will do with the Crayola 246-pack. Or you might get the 2-pack and say, what a ripoff, I'm not even going to color because it's not fair. And so you have nothing, right? And so that's where the choice is. The freedom is how you respond to your circumstances, not necessarily that you can change your circumstances. And in this sense, someone could actually be more free, imprisoned, than the very guards who are imprisoning them. Because if you are being authentic, true to yourself, and free with your attitudes and your responses, even though you don't have physical freedom, you are more free than these guards who are maybe have to work there to pay their bills, to keep their wife and children fed and clothed, to have a certain status in the community, where they become just puppets of a state-sponsored machine, and you, this incarcerated criminal, could be freer than all of them. Incredible. I mean, I just love this theory. And this allows you to embrace the paradox. You can believe in absolute universal objective truth, you just realize you don't know what that is as an individual. You have little t truth, subjective truth, based on your own personal experience and perspective. But you can embrace both the free will and sovereignty of God in this case. It's not like Aristotelian logic where you have to choose either or. Many existentialists, you have to qualify this stuff, are very comfortable living with mutually contradictory thoughts, logically contradictory, and it doesn't bother them. Where for the moderns or other people, they think that means they've won the argument. For these people, they don't care. Okay, I think that's let me make sure I got it. Individual, alienation, angst, authenticity, rejects categories, truth is subjectivity, paradox. Are we out of time? Okay. Well, what I'd like you to remind me next class is I want to tell you about Thomas Nagel's book, A View from Nowhere, and that's where we'll pick up. All right, thank you.